Hello, human geographers. We are back for our final lecture from our unit number 5, Agricultural and Rural Land Use. Now, first off, let me go ahead and apologize for my voice. Still improving. Hopefully it's not going to squeak or crack or anything like that. But here we go. Let's go ahead and launch into this. Tonight we're going to be talking about rural land use. And we're going to look at ways that rural settlements are set up in a different way than urban settlements. All right? So let's go ahead and get started. We start out with a definition. Rural settlement. Sparsely settled places away from the influence of large cities. So the way that they're set up is a little bit different than urban areas. Now, there are some similarities that we'll point out, but even still, they're quite a bit different. So we're going to look at some patterns that exist in the way that rural settlements are set up. Typically, some of the terms that you'll hear associated with rural areas are like villages, hamlets, farms, as well as other isolated areas. And typically, these rural settlements are going to engage in the primary sector. So what would be a good review right now would be to list what are some of those primary sector activities. Yes, agriculture, but what are some other primary sector activities that would fall into that? Because think the state of Nevada. We don't have a lot of agriculture in our rural areas. So what other primary sector activity dealing with extraction would we see in our rural settlements? And then think of some other ones. All right, let's look at the two different types of rural settlement patterns that we see existing. These are the two broad categories, and then we can fit in some more specific examples as we look at these, and we will. All right, so we start out with clustered and dispersed. Clustered being very close together, dispersed being much further apart. And those are terms that we introduced back in Unit 1 when we were talking about concentration. Now, on the clustered side, obviously it means that they're in very close proximity, they're very close together. And there's different categories, linear, circular, things like that. As far as examples of, for example, circular rural settlement patterns, we can see that in sub-Saharan Africa has circular rural settlement patterns, even now to this day, circular patterns. Northern Germany, as a historical example, had more circular settlement patterns. And remember where von Thunen developed his model. It was in northern Germany. And so maybe it makes sense why he came up with concentric rings, because he was living in a rural settlement that was circular in nature already. All right. As far as U.S. history, colonial New England is a great example of a clustered rural settlement. And typically, the colonial New England settlements are going to be centered around what is known as a common, okay, or commons. And we're going to show you an image of that here in just a minute. On the flip side of that, the dispersed settlement pattern is, as the name kind of suggests, more isolated. And we see that a lot in North America, particularly land west of the Ohio. The Great Plains is a great example of this. Very dispersed, far apart. And even the mid-Atlantic colonies were set up using a more dispersed pattern called meets and bounds. But largely, the reason that North America has a more dispersed rural settlement pattern, especially in land west of the Ohio, is because of a system called the township and range system. We're going to talk about that here in just a couple minutes. So taking a look at a colonial New England rural settlement, we can see in the center of this image, we have the commons, which is going to have the church, it's going to have town hall, it's going to have some of your businesses, things like that. And then as you get further away from there, you're going to have homes and farmsteads and things like that. Notice in this image, what is the tallest building? That no matter where you are in the settlement, what would you be able to see? And it's the church. And in that way, rural settlements, especially like this one in colonial New England, have some similarities to a modern central business district, because a modern central business district is going to have the tallest buildings. It's going to be very visible no matter where you are in the city. Well, the central point of a rural settlement, especially where like a church, for example, would be, is probably going to be the tallest point in the town, is going to be visible from anywhere where you are in that village, hamlet, what have you. All right. Now, part of the reason why there was a movement from more clustered to more dispersed was, beginning in England, was the enclosure movement during the Second Agricultural Revolution, which got rid of the commons, which was land that anyone could use, and particularly poor farmers would use, and allowed private farmers to come in and buy up that land from the government, which then led to fewer smaller farms and larger farms. All right. Those larger farms, though, were more efficient because you only had a few farms, and everything was consolidated. Everything could be done on one parcel of land. And without these small plots of land, you could start to use more machinery more efficiently and things like that. And the other side of this is, from a rural settlement standpoint, it led to those farmsteads being further apart, because those smaller farmers that might have dotted the landscape were now pushed out, and a lot of them moved to the city or worked as farmhands. And so you had fewer farmsteads, and those farmsteads were further apart. So this movement starts to begin in England, but then we see there's an explanation for it in the United States as well. But that was that shift from more clustered, where you have a higher density of farmsteads because they were a lot smaller farms. And then after the enclosure movement, fewer farmsteads, and those being further apart. So there's a couple different types of land survey patterns that leave a fingerprint on the landscape. And particularly here for the United States, that's what we're going to be talking about. All right. Now, from before, we talked about New England as a clustered and more circular rural settlement pattern. We're going to look at a couple other types. Okay. So one land survey pattern that we see here in the United States, particularly in areas colonized by the French, like Maine, Louisiana, southern Canada, those areas, we see a long lot system, right? And this is a clustered but linear form of rural settlement pattern. Okay, so Louisiana is a great example of this. Along the St. Lawrence River, because that's going to be an important part of the long lot system, as we're going to see here in just a couple minutes. All right, we're going to see this type of settlement pattern. Then in the mid-Atlantic colonies that were colonized by the English, not New England, that was also colonized by the English, but in the mid-Atlantic colonies, we started to see more dispersed patterns in what was called the meets and bounds. And this used basically markers on the landscape to discern where the boundaries would meet. And that's essentially what we're talking about. And so we're going to show an image of it here in just a minute. And then finally, particularly for the areas that are especially still very rural in the United States, the interior part of the country, land west of the Ohio, the Great Plains region, we're seeing the township and range system. Now, I'm going to tell you guys right now that we went over 3 different types of patterns in unit number 1. Do you remember what they were? 3 different types of patterns. All right. They were, and if you can list them, pause it, list them, because this is a good review. The 3 types of patterns were linear, geometric, and irregular. And I'm going to tell you guys right now that these 3 fit into each of those. So let's take a look. So let's go ahead and take a look at our first rural settlement pattern, and that is the long lot system. Again, this was in areas colonized by the French. So in the images that you see down at the bottom, the one on the right is from Hermitage, Louisiana, and that is the Mississippi River running through it. The one that you see on the left is from Quebec in Canada, and that is the St. Lawrence River that you see. Now, again, we said that each of these examples were going to have a different pattern to this. The long lot system is a linear pattern, okay, very, very straight and narrow. And if you take a look at the images, you can see these very narrow strips of land, these small plots of land, very narrow. And these plots of land, the intent was to have equal access to the river, that farmers would have access to water to help with irrigation for their crops and things like that. All right, so that's what we see. And when we see that image, especially the one on the left of Quebec and the St. Lawrence River, we can see those very narrow strips of land, each with equal access to the river, the St. Lawrence River. Now, the next one that we're going to talk about is metes and bounds. And again, this was used by the English in the mid-Atlantic colonies. All right? And not the southern colonies. The southern colonies were largely plantations, were already dispersed. We're talking mid-Atlantic colonies. Okay, not New England, because that was clustered and circular largely. Okay, we're talking mid-Atlantic. All right, and in these areas, they used natural features to separate boundaries between different plots of land. All right, and so if you take a look at this, some of the boundaries that are used are the great white oak, the felled maple, a big rock. All right, so these were the markers on the landscape that were used as boundaries between these two plots of land. And so the pattern that we see here, what pattern do you think this is going to create? Is every plot of land going to look the same? Well, no, of course, because they're going to be irregular. So this is our irregular pattern. And our final system of land survey use is township and range. Now, a little bit of background behind this. The township and range system was actually created as part of what was known as the Public Land Survey System, which was created as part of a piece of legislation called the Land Ordinance of 1785. And it started in Ohio and moved westward from there. Now, the original concept came from Thomas Jefferson to kind of create a system for farmers and to address some of the issues that I'm sure you can imagine would develop in the metes and bounds system, where they're using just natural pieces of the landscape to use as boundaries. Well, things change over time. So this was going to be a very systematic way to divide up the landscape. And so what it did was created a grid-like pattern on the landscape. So as far as our pattern and how we describe it, it was geometric in nature, and specifically it created a system of squares because we're using grids. Now the terms township and range. Townships were measured north and south, right? And then ranges measured east and west. So what they would refer to it as, and you can see in the example there, they have township 2 south, range 3 west. All right, and so we can see that based off what they had were baselines, which is your x-axis, and a principal meridian, your y-axis. All right, and this would create a 36-mile, square mile, a plot of land, which then could be subdivided into 1 square mile plots of land, which then could be subdivided even further into a half section, quarter section, things like that. And so that's what you see in the image there, is the subdivision of this. You know, that township 2 south, range 3 west was then further subdivided into 36 1 square mile plots of land, and that, you know, the 14th one of that 1 square mile could be subdivided even further. Right? And so this created a very systematic way to divide up the landscape. And when you take a look at both states and counties as you move further west, you notice that they get very boxy, especially in that Great Plains region. And that's a great example of a region where you would see the township and range having the biggest impact. All right. So that's it for our agriculture and rural land use unit. I will see you guys back in class, hopefully with a less squeaky voice. Have a good night, everybody.